I'm going to talk a little bit about something I've been devoting some time of the last year or so, Russians' lessons learned. I just want to start by dispelling a stereotype, because there might be someone who held the view, these stupid Russians, they never learn anything, just doing what they always have done. We're all back to the Cold War, or sorry, the Second World War, and it's just mass. We need to take Russian learning very, very seriously. The war is the largest cycle of adaptation and innovation in Russia. There's a lot of things happening, and if you don't believe me, ask anyone on the Ukrainian front line. Are the Russian troops learning anything? Yes, they are. They're not learning everything, though. I would say in general, the further down you go into the line, the more learning you have. So if it comes to technology and tactics, you have quite a free-ranging, wide-ranging debate. Operations, yes. Strategy, some. Policy, that's difficult. So the really frank and open policy discussion, particularly choices regarding to the war, is a bit roundabout. I will get to that in a little bit, but a good colleague there, Massacre, just wrote a long foreign affairs piece where she lists some of these processes in the ecosystems, over 20 different commissions sitting and implementing lessons, over 450 changes to combat manuals. There's a lot of things happening. Why have I dug into this, and why do I think it's interesting? I treat this a bit as an early warning. I think, what kind of capabilities will Russia have tomorrow? We will be informed by the lessons they're drawing today and how it develops their thinking. That's why I want to do this. I was also very intrigued by the fact that the start of the war in Ukraine really was kind of a failure for the two concepts that has been most prominent in Russian discussions of future war the last decade. The increasing relevance of non-military means and the use of non-contact warfare. Let me explain. I did write a book on the perception of non-military means and their increasing importance, and the whole war was premised on a strategy of a coup d'etat, a strategy of non-military means that was basically going to disable Ukrainian political and military command and control to the degree that it would more or less be to walk in and take the country. That kind of failed. Non-contact warfare, I'll explain that a little bit more, but it's really the long-range precision strikes from standoff distances that has been a recurrent topic in Russian thinking of future war for decades. Now we have the largest strike campaign Russia's ever conducted, still haven't yielded any tangible political results. So I wanted to see, what does Russian military theories do of this? They go into a war, both kind of key concepts fail. Do they throw them out of the window and start thinking about some other stuff? Let me start. First of all, I'm going to skip the discussion on non-military means. We can take them in the Q&A, but it's quite simple. It is perceived still as more important for one single reason. NATO is the main enemy. And the main confrontation with NATO today from the Russian side is being fought by non-military means, and the majority of the Western response, be it sanctions, isolation, technology restrictions, etc., are being done by the West by non-military means. That importance has maintained. But today I will focus in the other, these three categories, a little bit on technology, more on strategy, and then on contact warfare. And it does have a logic. You will see it very soon. First of all, I would like to give this quote by Vasily Trushin, who's Deputy Chief of General Staff. I think it's fantastic. The special military operation became a serious test for our military theory, our approach to preparation and development of the armed forces. It can be said with full justification that the test has been passed. Oh, wonderful. Good work. However, it would be unfair to claim that before the SVO, we managed to fully foresee the nature of modern operations, did everything necessary. This is not only funny, it's actually quite accurate, because you remember what I said. Less discussion on strategy and political choices, that is by and large still holds. Despite everything you're seeing and all the lessons being learned, there's no major changes on the, let's say, the highest level concepts on what you think that you should be doing, but there is still quite a bit of learning. And this was written in the spring this year, and I would take it as kind of a quite formal declaration of what the General Staff thinks, because a Deputy Chief of General Staff doesn't just go out and improvise this kind of stuff. Technology, I think this is known to most people. Russian theorists talk about the transparent battlefield. Sensors everywhere manage to give an unprecedented insight into what's going on quite far into the front line. This, of course, comes from drones in particular, but also satellite-based assets, including commercial ones, the degree of insights you can get. They also see that Ukrainian armed forces managed to turn conventional weapons, such as an artillery, not just from barraging wide ranges of territory, but to actual high-precision weapons. By utilizing the information and the sensors that is available, we have seen a different character of the fighting. This, in turn, impacts strategy. It has given rise to, Russian theorists again, calling positional deadlock. For a number of reasons, and here is very important to remember that a number of these are context-specific to what happened in Ukraine in 2023, when you started to have trenches, minefields, lack of infantry, lack of command capacity. A number of these factors drove the big drone war that we're seeing today. That doesn't mean that every war will look the same, but in the positional deadlock, the transparent battlefield is a critical part of driving the positional deadlock. And it's really hard to get to maneuver. You know, all Western militaries talk about maneuver warfare. Army manual here in Sweden says, you know, by maneuver tactics, a numerically inferior, we can beat a numerically superior enemy by maneuver warfare. And that rings quite true from military history, but it's quite of a problem. If all of the front line is transparent, that kind of undermines two foundational concepts of maneuver: concentration of forces and surprise. This is kind of what you do. This is kind of when maneuver warfare is good. I will get back to that in a little bit, but just as most Western militaries, maneuver warfare is still sort of an ambition within the Russian armed forces, and the question is how to get back to that. This ties into, I would say, the longest-standing debate in Russian military strategy, one of the debate between a strategy of destruction and a strategy of attrition. This in particular took place and originated in the 1920s and 1930s, with the lessons from the First World War, but also the noticing of, the pioneering of the concept of deep operation, but also the noticing of the German capabilities that they're building up. And I would say the jury was quite split before the Second World War. Is the strategy of destruction, the blitzkrieg, is it a viable military strategy? Could you actually win by this? Well, now we have the answer. And I would say after the Second World War, the Russian debate tilted fully to the strategy of attrition. Stalin's 5 permanently operating factors really codified how Soviet military strategy saw this type of both blitzkrieg and surprise. This has waxed and waned, and I would say strategy of attrition has been more of the historical constant, but just as maneuver warfare, a strategy of destruction has been the aspiration. This in particular took course, of course, in the Gulf War. I would say the most critical part of Russian modern military strategy came from the Gulf War. As you all know, numerically inferior American troops completely beat the Iraqi troops, relying on Soviet doctrine, Soviet materiel, by a superior situational awareness, long-range precision strike. And that's really what Russia wanted to get into since then. And that would have allowed for a strategy of destruction. Interesting, some of the discussions on the Russian military strategy actually get to policy if they couch them in these terms. If you start relating back to Svechin, if you start relating back to Tukhachevsky and this kind of dueling pair between destruction and strategy, they're kind of saying, and I can point you to the articles by senior general staff officers saying, strategy of destruction is basically what we would have preferred. I mean, the Russian armed forces were forced to rely more of a strategy with a very heavy ground presence because of the political choices. We were going to take and control territory. We could rather have just lobbed thousands of missiles, but that would have necessitated a decapitating blow in an initial period war, which also, again, can be implicit criticism because that's not the Russian strike campaign that started on the 24th of February. That was something completely different. Bear in mind this contrasting pair, and I'll go back to non-contact warfare. I think one of the most interesting discussions in the early 2000s between Vladimir Slipchenko, Lieutenant General, and Mahmoud Garayev, former Deputy Chief of General Staff and President for the Russian Academy of War Sciences for 20 plus years or so. Vladimir Sliksenko was the radical. He said, given the new long-range precision strike weapons, war will be non-contact. He even suggested raising all of the branches. Forget the old army navy. We're going to have strategic offense and strategic defense. He basically saw the war as two opposing sides lobbing missiles at each other. Quite similar to maybe the Israeli and in Iran exchange that we saw. Mahmoud Garayev at the time, he said, no. Look at Russian military history. The only way we win war is through mobilization. Endurance and mobilization. And it's really interesting because Slipchenko's view kind of won at the time, and a lot of the New Look reforms were specifically meant for informatization of the armed forces, getting rid of the old Soviet mobilization system, bringing the Russian armed forces into high-tech military. But I would say Garayev, from the other side of his grave, kind of won after the war in Ukraine started, back to the idea that industrial mobilization is the key to victory. Interesting about non-contact warfare, when you read Russian discussions on future war today, this is kind of seen as the way to get back to maneuver, the way to break the positional deadlock. And right now, they're getting a lot of practice. The leaps and reconnaissance strike complexes that they mostly have been talked about is now being more and more implemented. We're seeing huge improvements in dynamic targeting, for instance, and we're seeing the massive sensors and shooters that has been, I would say, topic for decades. And I think we're already seeing a bit of this in practice. Some of you know Rubicon. It's a center set up with the Russian MOD, announced last autumn, where they take some of the best drone operators from the front, together with people producing drones, including the People's Military Complex, the Narodny VPK, and you start experimenting, developing manuals, but you also have specific units reinforcing the fronts. And they, in their turn, targeting most often Ukrainian drone operators with fiber optic FPVs, the ambush tactic, they fly close to road and then wait there, so you only get a couple of seconds of warning. And this is a serious threat to Ukraine's drone superiority, and it starts kind of withering away Ukraine's advantage with the hope to break the positional deadlock and make maneuver possible again. Implications. Well, to end, when I'm seeing the Russian general staff thinking about future war, really what they would have preferred, if I read between the lines, is really the massive application of non-contact warfare in the initial period award. Basically delivering the overwhelming, decapitating strike to the point that the adversary cannot recover. That is a lesson learned. Unified information system, I think it's something probably all armed forces have been talking about for decades. It's something that the Russians have been talking about since 2008, if not before that. But now it's actually more coming to place than before. Russian advantage is not necessarily high-tech, that is the problem, but good enough tech in mass. And that is actually a problem, because I think most of our Western armed forces are still optimizing ourselves for the Gulf War, with a small number of hyper-potent platforms with long-range precision strike and C4ISR capabilities, but lacking the mass. I think the UK's SDSR has some interesting thoughts of that. Right now, we have a Russian capacity of 70,000 Gerans, basically missile drone, 2,500 kilometers range. That allows that kind of reconnaissance shooter complex, actually even down to the tactical level. Producing it quite cheaply, I think around $8,000 at this point, plus the decoys. If you take one silly, albeit revealing example, when you shoot down the Gerans with air defense missiles for $200,000, you're quite in a bad place. You're even worse place if you're shooting down decoys for less than that with air defense missiles.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.